Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Parlez-vous?
So I'll give you a brief background. I used to work at the Tank Museum, and after I'd left, there was a bit of a gap, and then I was approaching Cranfield regarding a research project when the Bullecourt project came up. So tanks and archaeology, I seemed to be a good fit, so I was lucky enough to get involved. I'd never really heard of Bullecourt. It was just one of those names when you read the First World War, so I was intrigued when I got more reading and researching the subject, how important a little battle became, especially it's one of the triumvirate of the Australian battles, Pozieres, Fromelles and Bullecourt. The Australians talk about Bullecourt very much. It's always very topical. Similarly with Fromelles, there are suspected grave sites at Bullecourt with about 700 missing, which people want to excavate, but because of the politics in France about digging up human remains on the Western Front, it's a bit touchy generally. That's the most photographed tank on the Western Front of the First World War. It's one of the Bullecourt tanks. It was near the German lines, so technically couldn't be seen by the British artillery. So every man and his dog on the German front tried to get his photograph taken, and there are innumerable postcards if you look on certain online sales sites. So the historical background to the battle. After the Somme campaign of 1916, the exhausted German defenders started to develop a more detailed idea of a defensive nature to their war, and put in place the planning and construction of the Siegfriedstellung or Hindenburg Line. And in March 1917, the German army withdrew their forces to this heavily fortified line of defences, which consisted of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, complex lines of barbed wire and trenches, which had specific support as opposed to just firing positions. Furthermore, the withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line allowed the Germans to shorten their front by approximately 25 miles and releasing 13 divisions, which resulted between 10 and 20,000 men, and ideally making their positions easier to defend. Operation Ulbricht was the name given to the plan, which resulted in a successful manoeuvre which caught the Allies unaware. While the Germans were planning moving house, as the British Prime Minister Lloyd George later called it, the Allies were thinking of their 1917 spring offensive. One such idea by the French General Nivelle, the defender of Verdun, was a proposal which was going to end the war. His persuasiveness prompted Lloyd George to back the French and force the commander of the British forces, Field Marshal Haig, to support the Nivelle offensive. This support would be by the British forces of the 1st, 3rd and 5th Armies attacking the Arras sector 1 week before the French started their assault, which in theory would draw Germans away from the Aisne sector, allowing the French to succeed. When the Germans therefore withdrew to the Hindenburg Line, it was thought that the Nivelle offensive would be called off as circumstances had changed radically. But this proved not the case. Nivelle insisted that nothing had changed and forced the issue through, quoting, "The German army will run away, they only want to be off." So at 4:45 on the 11th of April, the Australians of the 4th Division launched their assault on the heavily defended position of the Hindenburg Line. Their objective was to capture and occupy the two defensive trenches named OG1 and OG2 and proceed into the village of Bullecourt itself. Significantly, 12 tanks had been assigned to the division and were to break through the mass of barbed wire to allow the infantry to breach the trench line and on to their objectives. These were the early days for tank warfare. The cooperation needed between a tank and infantry assault had not been readily understood, let alone practiced. As with the most grand scheme battles of the First World War, the Nivelle Offensive, or the Second Battle of the Aisne, the 16th to 25th of April 1917, was hoped and promoted by General Robert Georges Nivelle, who had made his reputation at Verdun, to break the German defences within 48 hours. He had a firm conviction that the German army was now ready for collapse after the Verdun and Somme campaigns. Therefore, a masterstroke was needed for a complete rout. At the Conference of Military Representatives of all the Allied powers, held at French General Headquarters, Nivelle spoke to the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. Usually a cautious and suspicious politician, when dealing with anybody, especially soldiers, he was convinced to adopt Nivelle's plan and tell the British command of its participation. It was portrayed as a technique he had used so successfully during his counterattacks at Verdun, but upscaled, involving the entire front rather than a sector. To the war-weary politicians, the enthusiastic French general's plan was welcome. He persuaded the British Prime Minister that if the British launched a diversionary assault to draw German troops away from the Aisne sector, the French offensive could succeed. It was agreed in the London Convention of 16th January that the French assault on the Aisne would begin in mid-April and that the British would make a diversionary attack in the Arras sector approximately 1 week prior. Any major offensive on the Western Front is liable to be spotted by an appreciable enemy. The build-up of troops, movement of men and equipment, which is necessary for the large battle plans of the First World War, which dominated warfare on this landscape, is inescapable. But the coming campaign in this sector seems to have had more than its fair share of prior warning. The French had timed this assault on April the 16th, and from the very start, their plan was based on surprise, which it was not. Although an offensive appears to have been widely talked about in the Parisian cafes, the actual plan was found during a German operation. The German Third Army had undertaken a local operation on the Champagne battlefields, and amongst the captured material was an order of the Second French Infantry Division, pointing to a great offensive on the Aisne for April. Such prior administration in the battlefield and sloppy disregard of secret orders may seem like an unfortunate accident, but a second incident occurred later where a non-commissioned officer was taken prisoner by the Germans, and a document he carried gave the order of battle and the various core objectives of the troops north of the Aisne. Here the whole scheme was given away. Therefore, as most operations along the Western Front had to have at least a base desire to achieve comfort in mutual support, be it in the defensive or in the large offensive campaigns, the British part to play in the Nivelle offensive lay in the Battle of Arras, which, to act as a feint, would draw Germans to defend that area. Ludendorff possibly knew the date of the offensive and where it was to be made, but the full details of Haig's secondary and supporting attack may not have been discovered by the Germans, and they might well have believed the French attack would be the sole effort. So the Germans retired to the Siegfriedstellung, or the Hindenburg Line. The effects of the Somme battles had rendered the Germans a terrible blow. Germany was hurt more by the Somme than either the British Expeditionary Force or the French, and it became a vital part of the process of weakening the German army. The German High Command had by now decided upon a purely defensive policy in the West, while awaiting the effects of the submarine campaign and exploiting gains in the east. Field Marshals Hindenburg and Ludendorff's review of the German front line after the appointment of the 5th of September 1916 saw the physical reality of their forces. Strategically, and even by defending standards, the Germans were left holding a front which was longer than they could effectively man, insufficiently protected by natural obstacles, and forming a salient which might someday prove a trap. Therefore, decisions were made for a tactical withdrawal to a strong resistors line, which included the perfection of an idealised defensive zone with artillery observation from the rear and carefully sited trench lines on reverse slopes to prevent British artillery observation. Throughout the winter, the German services in the rear laboured to prepare a new Hindenburg Line. These strategic positions had the great advantage of shortening the front and economising forces. There had been ample opportunity to observe what the Germans were planning as far as construction of a defensive line. By the very nature of such a huge build, it would be impossible not to interpret what was happening. Further to this, aerial observation had also seen this and reported. Observers of the 3rd Brigade Royal Flying Corps had observed new trenches were being dug by the enemy, far behind his present defences, notably in the north of Queant. Aircraft from No. 11 Squadron Royal Flying Corps reported revealing a new and continuous line stretching from west of Boulogne Wood past Queant, rounding Bullecourt, crossing the Sancy River and passing south of Heninel to join the German Third Line southeast of Arras. Came the day the Germans withdrew and they had successfully installed themselves into their new home. And behind them lay waste and devastation, conducting a scorched earth policy, and in some areas the obliteration the Germans left behind was so complete that it was difficult to locate positions. That destruction also caused problems later by the inadequate state of roads needed to bring heavy artillery to parts of the new front. So the coming Arras offensive was mainly a Third Army affair, although it was recognised that if the breakthrough was successful, the Fifth Army would be well to the left rear of the German front at Arras, and the Third Army's attack would sweep across General Gough's front. Therefore, Field Marshal Haig wanted Gough to be ready to engage if the opportunity arose. Just as the attack of the Third Army was subsidiary to that of the French, so the Fifth was to operate in support of the Third. Eager to please Haig and not to be left out of any laurels where Allenby was concerned, Gough's motives for any support has an added bias. It was General Gough himself who suggested the intervention of the Fifth Army, and he was eager to do all in his power to aid the Third Army. There are conflicting aspects to what Gough actually proposed and to what state the Fifth Army was in. These considerations are also amplified when the realisation as to the planned direction the attack may go. If Gough's attack is instrumental in breaking the line, he may be the saviour of Allenby. Initially, only artillery support was going to be what the Fifth Army could offer. However, Gough later changed this, not merely by the use of artillery, but by attacking with infantry part of the Hindenburg Line. Looking for a suitable front to launch his assault, he therefore decided on Bullecourt as the scene of the attack. So if you can see, that's the main Arras front, Bullecourt being down at the bottom there. Gough had used success at a village of Choiseul previously, which had been almost an identical attack on Bullecourt, which had been captured by the Fifth Army on the 2nd of April. It had a similar representation of plan to Bullecourt, So that's where the attack would go in. Even better that the village was on the Quéant-Drocourt switch, which would put the Germans in a complete rout when attacked. A breach of the Hindenburg Line at the Bullecourt on the immediate flank of the Third Army's main offensive would be tactically of great assistance to General Allenby, it was thought. The assault to be carried out by 62nd West Riding Division on the left flank, with the 4th Australian Division of the 1st Anzac Corps attacking the right flank of the village with secondary objectives further beyond that. So they were planning to attack Bullecourt, go further along to Riencourt and then Hendecourt. It was proposed to be an easy assault, but that Quéant-Drocourt switch there was like a spaghetti junction. It was full of German reserves, ready to go to either side if there was a planned offensive. General Allenby's Third Army thus launched the Arras offensive on the 9th of April 1917. In its initial stages, the onslaught was a brilliant success. The German defences were broken through. Former German bastions such as Nouvelle Vitasse, the northern segment of the Hindenburg Line, and most famously Vimy Ridge, fell like ninepins. German defences crumbled so completely in places that British progress threatened a limited breakout. Gough, keen to play a more substantial role on hearing about the success at Arras, pushed for the offensive against Bullecourt. However, the difficulty in bringing the resources necessary for the concentrated attack up to the new front line proved a significant impact on the availability of artillery, which was the mainstay of any Western Front offensive. And when that offensive began, it was seen that the artillery that was able to fire on the German lines proved to be inadequate and inconsistent, and failed to make sufficient breaks in the enemy's wire, sufficient for a large assault. Furthermore, there was insufficient artillery to support and help the infantry after the advance did get underway. These deficiencies in equipment and supplies made senior command increasingly frustrated. Specifically Gough, who was seen as the archetype cavalry officer, having a reputation as a thruster and who was known to be very impetuous. As news of success in Third Army spheres filtered down to Gough, he ignored what intelligence had been presented about the defences at Bullecourt and pressed on. Major Fortescue later wrote, significantly at Bullecourt, the wire about the Hindenburg Line was so strong that nothing short of a carefully prepared attack had any hope. So when the Germans had retreated to the Hindenburg Line, they destroyed everything behind them. So when it came to following up the Germans, the British couldn't do it quick enough but the roads were destroyed. Everything had to be rebuilt. The roads had to be rebuilt, and the heavy artillery which was needed for an assault was not there. They only had lighter artillery to plan the offensive. So when, in their conversations, a young major of the tanks, Major Watson, thought he'd throw in a plan to use tanks for the assault instead of using artillery. So during a staff meeting, Major Watson of D Battalion Heavy Branch Machine Gun Corps proposed a solution to address the deficiency in artillery. He suggested the use of tanks in a surprise attack on the trenches, with the infantry quickly following on behind. To take advantage of the breaches made by the tanks, Gough then accepted the scheme and proposed to proceed the next day, 10th of April 1917. Startled by the suddenness of the order, Watson proceeded with haste to get the tanks moving. So the idea was presented by Watson to Gough, and he said, yes, go now, without any planning at all. And the tanks were quite some distance behind the front line because they weren't expected to be used at all. So that's the front line. You can see where they call OG1 and OG2. OG1 and OG2 were just what the Australians termed Old German Line from Pozieres. So the overall plan for the deployment of the tanks was simple, but proved difficult in execution. 12 tanks were allocated to 5th Army and were to be drawn up in line 800 yards from the German positions and tasked to penetrate the Hindenburg Line east of Bullecourt. However, the intended attack on the morning of the 10th of April was postponed for 24 hours due to the tanks being delayed by a snowstorm, which made visibility difficult. For the infantry who were exposed to the elements, not all was going as planned. So effectively, 1 in a million chance there was a blizzard across the Arras Downs, which stopped the tanks proceeding in any speed that they could. As you well know, tanks only travel about walking pace, 4 to 5 miles an hour. And they got slowed down because they had a guy in front of the tanks showing them the way. So they were delayed by 24 hours. The Australian soldiers had been lying out in that all night, waiting for the off. And then they were told just by dawn they had to go back to their billets. So on the following day, the 11th, the tanks again were slow in arriving. Some on time for 0 hour, others still delayed. As Private Palmer, a soldier of the 48th Battalion Australian Infantry, recorded in his diary, "We fell in about 3 a.m. in battle order, snowing, when we marched off to the same positions as the morning previous, having this time the assistance of some tanks, not so many as we should have had owing to the drivers not being competent to do their duty. It being almost break of day when we were ordered to move off, the 46th Battalion to take his first line, the 48th to take his the second. Having no assistance from our artillery and not much from the tanks, we was at a terrible disadvantage. As the infantry had their orders to wait the required lead time before they followed in the tanks' wake, the tanks themselves had their specific instructions on attacking the Hindenburg Line trenches. The 12 tanks of 11 Company were subdivided into sections, forming 3 groups of 4 tanks. A right, left and centre section consisted of Captain Wyatt's section with tanks 586, 593, 711 and 799. These tanks, as well as leading elements of the 4th Australian Brigade through the enemy wire, had 3 specific duties to perform. First, to parade up and down the German wire immediately to the front of the attack. Second, to remain with the infantry in the Hindenburg Line until the defensive flank secured, and third, to accompany the infantry in their advance on Riencourt and Hendecourt. Lieutenants Davis in tank 799 and Clarkson in 586 would precede the infantry northwards in the assault on these villages. So they effectively were to go up the right-hand side, take out as much of trenches on the right, and then proceed to the villages. Now, as you'll see, Bullecourt, the Battle of Bullecourt, they're attacking a re-entrant, which is effectively soldiers were firing on them each side. The Germans had machine gun positions all along that line, so they were shooting right across. They didn't have much of a chance. Lieutenant Sweer's section on the left would lead the 2 battalions of the 12th Australian Brigade into the German forward positions, then turn outwards, followed by the infantry to storm Bullecourt and roll down the wire in front of it. This section of tanks, 531, 796, 797 and 800, were to lead the attack on the Hindenburg Line defences east of Bullecourt, flattening the barbed wire defences skirting the village with the Australians of the 46th Battalion mopping up behind them. So this next 3 branches, they would go to the left and attack Bullecourt itself and effectively try and break through the line, allowing the Australians to go in, hopefully to join in the middle. And the third group, led by Captain Field's section, comprised of tanks 585, 590 and 702, which would then attack the central road toward the German trenches and advancing up a slight depression. This would change immediately as Lieutenant Head's tank 702 had broken down and would not be available for the battle. So this centre section would go up in the middle. And there is, I don't know if you've ever been to the battlefield, there is a slight dip and there's a piece of dead ground which some of the tanks went into. The infantry assault began officially at 0430 hours, though some battalions were delayed by poor communications with conflicting orders, while others waited for their tanks before advancing. It had been hoped that the tanks would have reached the German line by dawn's approach. However, the delays had an unfortunate knock-on effect. At first light, the tanks became visible against the snow-covered ground, and according to another Australian diarist, 7 tanks were put out of action almost instantly with artillery shells clean through them. Now, the Germans had been warned against tanks generally across the board since they'd appeared on the battlefield. And they had been given notice that there was obviously a build-up on the front and be aware of tanks. And there were sections of German artillery to fire over open sights at any vehicles that they could see. So on the right flank, the tanks assigned to lead the 4th Brigade on the right flank started toward the German lines at 0430 hours. Lieutenants Puttock and Morris were met by tremendous machine gun fire when visible to the Germans. Tanks attracted such a storm of small arms fire that men watching from close on rear could at times see their shapes outlined by the sparks and the bullets that rattled against their sides. Puttock's tank then developed serious clutch problems and the decision was made to return to the railway embankment. Puttock struggled to get his tank back towards Norway amidst a storm of shells. It was dangerous for him and his crew to stay in the stranded tank as German shells landed close by and subsequently ordered the crew to abandon the tank. These 3 sections are different maps. Bean's map shows where tanks were supposedly finished in the battle. The bottom is a German appreciation and the top left is what is in the official war diaries. And they're all quite different. As previously mentioned, Lieutenants Clark and Davis were to break through OG1 and OG2 trenches and to proceed to the villages of Rioncourt and Hendecourt. Lieutenant Clarkson did manage to get to the barbed wire in front of OG1, and it is at this point he stopped. The checks were jammed by detritus, and a witness to this, an Australian Lance Corporal Bert Knowles, stated a tank penetrated the front line of the wire. In passing fairly close to it, I remember a chap standing near the front of it with a short plank and trying to lever a piece of iron from amongst the big cogs beneath the wheels and cursing like a bullock whilst the bullets were rattling like hail on the tank itself. Lieutenant Money in 590 in the centre section proceeded to reach the thick belts of barbed wire of AG1. Unfortunately, the spuds or tank grousers were caught fast in the wire. The Mark II tanks had like extra grip effect on their tanks, and they called those grousers, making it impossible to extricate. As the tank rocked backwards and forwards, it took 4 direct hits from the enemy mortar in quick succession. A stream of armour-piercing rounds followed, which easily cut through the tank's 9mm hull boilerplate, rupturing the fuel tank, which then exploded. Alongside Money in the centre section, Lieutenant Bernstein in 798 was hit in the cab and exploded in the body of the tank. Bernstein was stunned and temporarily blinded as the crew were crawling out. A second shell hit the tank roof. Tank 585 made no real progress. Situated near the 14th Battalion, HQ of the Australians, A shell struck the track shortly after crossing the railway embankment, and the crew evacuated before it received a direct hit. In the Lieutenant Skinner in 796, it's a classic German propaganda postcard showing the Germans sneaking up to the tank, but this is well past the battle. So Lieutenant Skinner in 796 had got ditched on the railway embankment and was eventually towed out by Morris, so Skinner's tank was late arriving. Skinner made for Bullecourt thinking that the battle had been in progress for more than 2 hours. The Australians must have fought their way down the trenches into the village. Progressing across the battlefield and seemingly attempting to follow the southern prong of the planned envelopment of the village, he was stopped by an impassable shell crater to their front. He tried to reverse, but he could not change gear, and the tank was motionless. The German machine guns concentrated upon it, and some of the crew were wounded by the splinters of metal, which were sent flying about its interior. The Germans then brought up a trench mortar, and the commander withdrew his crew. Skinner then made his way back to the embankment through no man's land without further casualties. As you can see, they are quite close to the German trenches, so he was very lucky to get his crew away, and he received the MC for that. Lieutenant Burkitt in Tank None 797 had attacked some positions of the line and then returned to the area of the railway embankment and 48th Battalion HQ of Colonel Lean. Asking for any instructions, Lean requested he move to the left of the 48th and clear the Germans from the sunken road there. Lean also pointed out the position of a German machine gun firing from Bullecourt and asked for it to be suppressed. This was carried out, and Burkitt returned to the HQ position. Near the embankment, he stopped the tank to take his bearings. That's where that is. As he was climbing out, a shell burst against the side of the tank and wounded him in the leg. Subsequently, the position of the tank was visible to the enemy gunners and thus brought a storm of fire upon that important centre. So that position was almost near the embankment, and where Colonel Lean had made a dugout for HQ. And unfortunately, Burkitt's tank landed right on top, so the Australians were getting the benefit of everything that the Germans were firing at the tank. Lean tried to secure its removal, but its officer had been wounded, and the tank continued to be shelled and later burst into flames. Lieutenant Burkitt was brought back on a stretcher and wounded a third time as he lay in the sunken road. Poor old Burkitt had been put on a stretcher next to the tank, and he was hit again while lying wounded, and as he was being taken back, he was hit a third time. I'll explain later about, I've been doing some genealogy on the families, and I'm in contact with Burkitt's daughter. Returning to the action at the forefront of the battalions of the battle, the Australian commander of the 16th Battalion, Major Percy Black, seeing that the infantry were bunching behind a stationary tank, which was 586, shouted his immortal words, "Come on boys, bugger the tanks." The infantry then squeezed past the tank and pockets of broken wire and proceeded into sections of OG1. It would appear that the appearance of 586 caused panic amongst the defenders of the trenches and the soldiers of the 124th Württemberg Regiment dispersed, allowing the infantry to enter the trenches successfully. So the Australians did manage to get into the trenches, but they were still taking an awful lot of fire. Meanwhile, 586 went forward again and crossed OG1, advanced to OG2 and cruised along the trench. The tanks worked in pairs, male and female. So the tank with the guns, the males, would aim at any machine gun posts and anything that they could officially observe. The females, armed with machine guns, would generally try and cruise up alongside a trench, shooting into the trenches to take out any soldiers there. On being met by direct shelling from field guns on either side of Riencourt, it turned and recrossed OG1, that's 586, but was put out of action on the edge of that trench, in which the survivors of that crew took shelter. Clarkson was killed, although it is unclear if the crew escaped or were later taken prisoner. And it's presumed the left one is Clarkson's tank. Lieutenant Harold Davis in 799 was to help the 4th Brigade enter OG1, consolidate the position before assisting in the advance on Riencourt. Starting on time but going off course in the darkness, travelling east instead of north and attacking the northern end of the balcony trench rather than OG1, crossing the line of the balcony trench system, and then he advanced about 40 to 50 metres towards the second line. Here was Lieutenant Schabel of the 123rd Grenadier Regiment with a machine gun and armed with a new armour-piercing ammunition. People say it was designed against tanks, but it had been around for the German Air Force as well. Engaging the tank at approximately 150 metres, he fired about 1,200 rounds. The tank was riddled with bullets and burst into flames. The tank knocked out by Lieutenant Schnabel was the first tank to be destroyed within the German lines. For days, it was the objective of officers of all ranks, some of whom had travelled long distances to be able to cast eyes on this amazing creature. When the Australians met the dense belts of barbed wire, having been funneled into areas which were deliberately designed for that purpose, the Germans opened fire. The Australians also had to undertake the unenviable task of not only attacking machine gun posts, deliberately sighted to mow down any infantry as they entered the field of fire, but also they had the added disadvantage of being fired upon either side due to attacking the re-entrant. Fighting through, they took their first objective, but were slowly reduced in numbers by a German counterattack. When it became impossible to reinforce those survivors with ammunition or reserves, the decision to withdraw was taken. Now, there's a lot of conflicting information about signals being sent by the 4 groups of Australians who were in the trenches. They were sending signals to send reinforcements and ammunition, but they were being ignored. Observers behind the lines, the Australian observers, were seeing German troops advancing, and they sometimes thought they were the Australian troops, so they didn't want to fire, causing a blue on blue, and it became very, very confused. For some Australians, it became a matter of deciding to return to their own lines rather than being taken prisoner. The ground over which the attacking force had just advanced was still being swept by machine guns and the artillery of the German defences. As Harry Murray, VC, stated, there were only 2 difficult choices: await capture or retreat across ground swept by German fire. At approximately 1100 hours, the Australian soldiers had withdrawn, and in effect the battle was over. The withdrawal came to those who had withstood the assault and heavy fighting in the German trenches as a heavy blow. The survivors reasonably thought they had done more in achieving the impossible by storming a heavily defended bastion with an experienced division of defenders than most. Many felt let down by their elements of the attacking force, mainly the tanks. This has subsequently become the norm that the tanks were to blame. Recriminations between the Australian infantry and the British command staff would cloud any proper analysis of the battle. The 2 brigades of the 4th Division that carried out the attack suffered over 3,300 casualties, and 1,170 Australians were taken prisoner. There are many elements which doomed the attack, but the most significant was its haste, which ultimately resulted in disaster. The tanks which were supposed to support the attacking Australian infantry either broke down or were quickly destroyed. However, although the infantry saw the role of the tanks during the battle as far from the wonder weapon which perhaps had been sold to them, valuable lessons had been learnt. An early pioneer of the tank arm, Sir Albert Stern, wrote that what was learnt at Bullecourt would lead to the developing tactics and stratagems of early tank and infantry warfare. After Bullecourt, it was realised that the tank could do those things for which then until massed artillery had been thought to be indispensable. They could cut the wire and they could protect the infantry with a mobile barrage in place of the creeping barrage of the guns. There is also an important element which often gets ignored by historians, and it's to do with the equality of the enemy. The fact that a very experienced German division was holding that part of the sector is often overlooked. Facing the assaulting soldiers were the 120th, 123rd and 124th Grenadiers of the 27th Royal Württemberg Division, which was considered to be one of the best in the German army. Under the command of General von Moser, an experienced and bullish officer, the Württembergers fought the Australians to a standstill and successfully repulsed the fearsome tanks. The capture of a tank at Bullecourt was a coup for the 123rd Württemberg Regiment, for it was the first British tank the Germans had ever captured and held on to. So that's the outline of the battle. As the basics of the battle, tanks were brought in because there wasn't enough artillery. They were supposed to break down the defences, which didn't really happen. They were outstripped by the infantry. Majority of the tanks were destroyed as soon as the Germans saw them in the light against the snow, and the battle proved to be a complete disaster. So my involvement, I'll explain the archaeology, what we were planning to do. We were planning, nobody really knew the positions of the tanks where they stopped. So it was a research question proposed for the group. So the primary objective of the survey was to explore the Bullecourt landscape and ground over which the tanks and infantry advanced. Although Charles Bean's map, The Official History of Australia in the War of 1418, Volume 4, is broadly correct as to the location of the destroyed tanks after the battle, it is possible by using contemporary aerial and ground photography to more accurately locate the tanks. The main objectives for the excavations of June 2017 were to place 2 5x5 metre trenches over the areas where the team believed the best chances for locating evidence for the fate of the tanks of Second Lieutenant Burkitt and Second Lieutenant Skinner. So although the map is quite small, can you see the red areas? So French archaeological restrictions were only allowed to dig trenches 5x5 because it's quite the battlefield. As you can imagine on the Western Front, put a spade in the ground, you will find human remains. And that's, the French don't look kindly on, you're not supposed to be looking for human remains. So it was a case for looking for tanks. But restrictions only allowed small trenches. So those areas where the red were where we were allowed to dig. And so before you dig, you always survey. Peter Masters of Cranfield University carried out a survey. And again, that picture is, can you see how pockmarked the survey is? So that's all bits of metal that's coming up from his geophys. And the bottom edge you can see is close to the embankment, and we believe it's where one of the small field cannon would have been emplaced. Sometimes you can see some of the bigger survey images, you can see the shell craters. So on the Tank 797 site, 1 5x5 metre square was excavated in the arable field just north of the railway embankment. over the potential destruction area of Tank 797, which was Burkitt's. Within this area, initially no cut features were visible, but after cleaning and weathering, a small shell crater was noted, which held a screw picket, presumably the source of the metallic anomaly on metal detection and geographical surveys. One shrapnel ball and some small shell fragments not retained by us. There was no real evidence of the tank, and the trench was not extended. It is likely that the bulk of this tank was thus retrieved either after the battle or by subsequent investigators. Now, there had been some battlefield salvage. Salvage teams desperately were salvaging as many tanks as they could for spare parts because they were sometimes slow in arriving. So on the Tank 796 site, again, one 5 by 5 metre square was excavated in the pasture field to the immediate southeast of the village of Bullecourt, which is, you can see, this is an aerial photograph taken by Philip Kaczynski, the guy who excavated Deborah. So he came to the site as soon as he heard we were there. That was excavated over the potential area of the destruction of Tank 796 and adjacent to the Bullecourt Avenue trench. Within this area, one small shell crater was observed, and a much larger crater, only partially excavated at the time, was also noted. German corrugated iron, known colloquially as elephant iron, was seen at the southeast of the excavation area, but this was left in situ and not lifted. To the northeast edge of the excavation area, a segment of tank track was found, and it was quite a hefty chunk. Had to get a tractor to lift it out. On lifting this track portion and subsequent trowel cleaning of the area, 2 sets of human remains were found. A 1 by 1 metre extension to the northern bulk of the trench was required to ensure full retrieval of one of these skeletons. The initial interpretation is that 2 German soldiers were killed, having been using the destroyed tank as part of a machine gun shelter. They were then buried in a large crater with ground sheets placed over them and potentially the tank track. So that was the overall site. Again, quite small view of the back. And where sort of test pits, they call, were dug. And that's the section of various tank bits which were found in that excavation. So where I said that tank, Skinner's tank, with the Germans surreptitiously looking at it, that was that site. And quite a lot of obvious tank bits. They don't readily come off anything else. So there were many tank components recovered, from the shell case and the percussion cap protectors through to cogs that drove the chains and the chains themselves. Furthermore, armour plate was recovered, along with numerous rivets that both illustrate the thickness of the armour protection of the vehicle and also the post-war destruction of what was left of the tank, either by villagers who had returned to Bullecourt or by members of the Chinese Labour Corps who undertook such tasks. The concentration of material connected with the tank in the southeast corner of our excavation hinted that there may well be further opportunities for recovering tank components in future seasons. So that's part of the tank armour. I'll give it to you. So part of my interest in the tanks, there's a lot of talk about Mark II tanks being boilerplate. Now, boilerplate in a steam engine term is good quality metal. When you mention it to First World War tank enthusiasts, especially around the vicinity of the Tank Museum, boilerplate has a negative connotation. So I was interested in where does this Mark II boilerplate question come from, and what is the quality of Mark I tank armour to Mark IV tank armour, and if there is any difference. So those various pieces were found field walking. As you do archaeology, one of the first things you do is it's non-obstructive. You just walk the field and see if there's anything which stands out from the norm. So various pieces of metal were picked up by myself and given to me as part of the project. That piece that's going around came out of one of the excavations. And I also was given some other pieces from other tank sites. Another aspect of the what I was looking at regarding tanks, Colonel Swinton said in one of his training pamphlets, conditions inside the tanks are quite rough, but never mind the heat, never mind the noise. And they're in tank notes. There's a debate and a conversation about the effects of carbon monoxide on tank crews. So I was looking at also the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning on tank crewmen. So he says more people died through carbon monoxide poisoning in tanks than through combat. An anonymous statement sadly reiterated by Dan Snow. While working at the Tank Museum, this was one of the most common statements heard by myself and members of staff. When trying to find out where this statement came from, the ubiquitous bloke down the pub was the miscreant. Nonetheless, it has been in vain trying to find out where this rumour started and can be considered one of the Great War myths. There is no doubt that tank crew are affected by the noxious fumes produced by the engine. Add to the mix of toxins from the small arms and the 6-pound gun, along with the heat produced by the engine temperatures inside, which could reach 50 degrees centigrade or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. It would have been a heady mix. One Royal Army medical officer who wrote Medical Aspects of Tanks in 1920 later reported that carbon monoxide poisoning led to, in sequence, headaches, giddiness, palpitations, vomiting, unconsciousness, collapse and convulsions. Before passing out, crews suffered mental confusion. A later 1923 report stated entire crews lost consciousness inside the tanks or collapsed when again exposed to fresh air. The effects of CO poisoning need to be understood and acknowledged where tanks are engaged in battle. If we use the Battle of Bullecourt as an example, we can start to appreciate the conditions and medical effects the crew would have to endure. So going back to these guys, were told, get moving, you're going into battle tomorrow. And they were way behind the line. So the tanks started from their location at approximately 2000 hours on the evening of the 9th of April. Due to the deterioration in weather, the tanks were unable to achieve their battle position and had stopped near the village of Norway at dawn, which is still a 90-minute run to their designated place. Messages were relayed that the crews were exhausted and they were ordered to rest, but be ready to continue to their destination on command. With commencement of battle postponed, they did indeed have time to rest. However, resting in a war zone would also see that the need to service the tanks and carry out duties in keeping with that activity. Subsequently, the rest would be intermittent. Upon the receipt of further orders, the tanks left their resting place at Norway and proceeded to the village of Bullecourt. We do not know exactly what time the tanks departed, but working from their timings of their arrival, the first at 0330 hours on the 11th of April, and with our knowledge that their journey should take 90 minutes, an approximation of 100 hours would make for a reasonable assumption to allow for any delays. Using the available evidence, we can develop a reasonable assumption of a crew's carboxyhemoglobin levels, the incapacitating levels of CO and therefore COHB of approximately 30 to 40%, which would place the crews in a position where they were barely operating at a proficient level. So they're in between the 10 to 50%, and they'd be suffering from headaches. They'd be slightly delirious, not sure what they were doing. So when they were told to they were going in action, and in a battle. They started in the dark, not readily seeing where the Australian infantry. It was not a surprise that the tanks went off in various directions and the battle for them didn't go as planned. Even with a seemingly long rest, the dissemination of CO would have been too slow, as the crews would have still needed to carry out some level of work. Subsequently, when they went into battle at 04:30 hours, with all hatches shut, they had already spent 12 hours out of the last 32 hours in the tank. As they preceded the infantry, the majority of tanks were out of action, either through mechanical failure of enemy action, mechanical failure or of enemy action. Except for tank 796, which was Skinner's, which had been delayed and entered the fray at approximately 0900 hours. Therefore, at a conservative estimate, the crews had spent between 14 to 16 hours in a tank within a period of 30 to 37 hours. 3 out of the 11 tanks managed to breach the first line of German defences before being put out of action. Out of the 11 tanks that reached the battlefield, all but one was destroyed. Recriminations at the time laid blame on the tanks, and therefore the crews, with even some accusations of cowardice by the accompanying infantry. However, it is recognisable that those crews would have been under the severest hardship of conditions, with maximal concentrations of COHB and the resultant symptoms of confusion, lack of concentration, dimmed vision and possible collapse. A statement within Notes on Tank Operations, April 1917, states the excessive heat frequently caused vomiting and exhaustion. 8 hours continuous work was about the limit of a crew's endurance, after which they reportedly required 48 hours rest. So following the heat and following the noise, temperatures could reach 120 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat inside was suffocating, generated not only by the guns, but also from the engine in the centre of the cabin. The presence of a full crew on board gave the opportunity for the accumulation of undue amount of moisture in the air, and that's Macpherson diseases of the war. Although not readily addressed at the time, it can be recognised that the combination of CO alongside excessive heat and humidity, which would increase respiration and heart rates, were likely to have a various effect on the crews. That's Richmond, 1939. And there's a thing called dry bulb heat and wet bulb heat. When you can't sweat, that's dangerous for a body. But again, these things were slightly ignored. So coupled with that, I also was again looking at noise, and you probably won't be able to see that differentiation. So studies in heat exhaustion show that the wet bulb temperature is the limiting factor with respect to the effects of heat on human performance, with dry bulb temperature being of only minor importance. Below a wet bulb temperature of 91 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees centigrade, men work easily and efficiently. The range in which men are capable of moderately hard work of 91 degrees to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, but decreased efficiency and alertness are evident. Above 94 degrees, 34 degrees centigrade, wet bulb temperature, major disability soon occurs, the average limit being about 1 hour of work. This is important as preservation of a normal body temperature in these circumstances comes to depend more and more upon the cooling effect produced by the evaporation of sweat from the surface of the skin. And when DBT is at or above the body temperature, a sufficiently rapid evaporation of sweat becomes the all-important factor. General Ellis, commander of the tank corps and staff at tank headquarters, dictated a set of notes learned after various battles on the limitation of tanks and crews, and states that the exhaustion of crews due to heat and difficulties of driving along with excessive heat causes vomiting and exhaustion. Again, using contemporary literature, Watson states Mack was driving himself, for his driver fell sick soon after they had started. The strain and the atmosphere were too much for his stomach. You cannot both drive and vomit. So again, following on from Swinton, never mind the heat, never mind the noise. Again, there are two main causes of hearing injury. Hearing acuity may be damaged by noise in the course of a short, intense exposure such as gunfire, or it may suffer a gradual deterioration over periods of months or years of exposure to high levels of continuous noise, as in travelling in noisy vehicles. Significantly, in the close confines of the tank, the machine gun would be instrumental to producing one factor to noise contribution, with the engine being a major contributor in another. The noise generated by the engine in the tanks made normal voice commands impossible. As Captain Haig states, all action inside is directed by signals. For when the tank moves, the noise is such as to drown a man's voice. Subsequently, hearing orders given within the confines of the tank were impossible, given the noise of the engine. A large hammer blow against the bulkhead would precede any orders. They were then relayed by a given set of hand signals between the crews. Noise would be increased dramatically when the weapons were fired. A machine gun will have a typical peak pressure of 165 decibels at the user's ear. Normal conversation is recorded at being 60 decibels, with hearing damage recorded at 120. Therefore, even though the gunner was only a few feet from his commander, he would be almost independent of command, as any orders issued could not be heard. Lieutenant Bion further mentions that the noise is so terrific when the engine is going that you can hear nothing outside, but bullets hitting the tank sound like sledgehammers against your ear. I thought I'd try and do a little genealogy and see if I could hunt down some of the crew members' descendants. So obviously, researching officers is always the easiest because there's more information available. So that's Major Watson, who was in charge of the tanks, and it was his idea to use tanks. Company commander at the time of Bullecourt. He authored two books, Adventures of a Dispatch Rider, published in 1917, and A Company of Tanks, published in 1920. As with any email conversations, they dip in and out. I've lost touch with his son, but hopefully pick it up again. Poor old Watson, after Bullecourt, he was moved to run supply tanks, and he wasn't effectively in any more combat operations, so he did survive the war. But I think it broke him, and he died quite early. So those of you who are familiar with Britannia and going to America, if you can see the officer walking in front, that's Captain Haig. He was in charge of one of the sections at Bullecourt. He also authors a tank, and that's available online as a PDF download. He authors Life in a Tank, published 19. It's okay as a First World War read, but I wouldn't take too much historical information. He goes from first person to second person, leaps back and forth, so it's like a good novel. And Second Lieutenant Burke, he was the most interesting. He was the first one relatives I contacted. I'm still in touch with his daughter. One of his daughters lives in Cyprus, where his MC is. His other daughter lives in Devon. So when Burkitt got out of the tank to literally find out where he was, he landed on 48th Battalion HQ. He was hit by a mortar. And again, as I said, he was lying on the ground on the stretcher when he was hit again. His daughter sent me his letters he sent to his parents saying everything's all right, he's in a hospital, everything's fine. But he had over 50 wounds in him. As he kept getting moved back to the various casualty clearance stations, they kept removing parts of his legs. And he ended up working for the... I've got a picture with him with General Haig at the Ex-Limitless Association. He wins the MC for his action at Bullecourt. There's a newspaper report at the top right. And that tiny picture is quite a big A12 picture, but it's him in his hospital bed in one of the hospitals. And McIlvaine, he was one of the tank commanders. His tank got hit almost immediately, so he didn't really take part in the battle. His tank had arrived in front of the abandoned the embankment, but got hit. He was Northern Irish. He used to work in a bank. Survived the battle, survived the war. Ended up going to fight in Russia with the tanks there as an advisor. Tracked one of his sons down to Argentina. He only died in the 80s, and it's like Bullecourt is one of those battles which is very hard to pin down. There's not a lot written on it, and imagine the opportunity lost that he only died in the 80s. He could have told us so much more. And Morris is an interesting one. Morris is second from left. Morris's company's still going. It's like a B&Q in Wales. And the nephew sent me quite a lot of photos. The interesting thing, when he sent me these photos of Morris, there's a picture of Burkitt. So that was great for the genealogy link. We know they're the same people. And it's interesting, with Burkitt, he's got his MC on his tunic. So he's come back, and he's back in uniform. So he hasn't skived off and decided no more war for him. And that's later presumed to be Morris's tank. One of the missing, a lot of the tanks were destroyed outright. Bodies were never recovered. Sometimes the tanks, the petrol tanks were above on the roof. So if they were hit, petrol streamed into the tank and crews were engulfed by fire. Some of the tank crews, it's probably about 2 tank crews maybe, were taken prisoner, and tracking those down is proving quite hard because there seems to be a couple of Smiths. Poor old Leslie Gardner, he's one of the missing. Now, for those of you who have links, Colonel Hardress Lloyd was D Battalion commander. So when that conversation with Watson, he said to Hardress Lloyd, let's use tanks. Then he said to Gough, let's use tanks. Gough said, okay. Hardress Lloyd and Gough had both been on the Tira expedition before the war. Now, if you like the Old Boy Network, does that work? Did that work in the First World War? And then furthermore, tracking down Hardress Lloyd's nephew is John Lloyd, who wrote Blackadder. Very nice chap. When I was having email conversations, do you have any paperwork, documents and anything? Nothing's gone, it's all left the family. But very nice, but it was an interesting link, the whole Blackadder thing. And going back to Burkitt, after the battle, he's then doing those promotional tank bank tours around the country. And these are, not that you can see back there, but these are when he's in Scotland doing the tank bank tours. So in conclusion, historically, the intense and harsh working conditions during a tank in action were never seriously understood or have been considered in tank histories. The heightened levels of stress and exertion would increase the amount of CO a crew member would absorb. The soldiers who manned the tanks during the First World War operated a machine which had many faults, of which it would have been impossible to fix during the early days of military machinery. The three traditional factors determining a tank's capability, firepower, protection and mobility, were the best of which was available during the expediency of development. However, bad conditions inside tank crews did their best to perform their duties. The men who operated the tanks at Bullecourt certainly performed above and beyond what they were asked to do. Although playing a part of the Arab Spring Offensive of 1917, the First Battle of Bullecourt has become synonymous with failure of the command structure to fully understand how they were committing troops to this particular assault. The senior staff officers cobbled together a hasty plan of attack using tanks. Buoyed up with the enthusiasm of successful operations further along the Arras centre of operations, they did not want to be left out. It is the part played by the new tanks as a supporting arm for Bullecourt which promised much but delivered little. However, tanks represented an innovation in use, tactics and a successful deployment which was too soon for some. General Gough's command style gave him a reputation and was seen as a man not to suspend offensive action on grounds of changed or unfavourable circumstances. Gough's failure in cavalry attacks defied contemporary experience and an unfortunate arrogance of being added to his general unpopularity. As Stephen Badsey argues, the metaphor of the charge against machine guns or the incompetent Victorian cavalry general attempted to control a tank battle has spread beyond military studies into the general vocabulary of historians and readers of history. Unfortunately, Gough fits this pattern too well. Any validity and criticism of the roles the tanks played at Bullecourt has to be seen as more than just apportioning blame. Without an in-depth forensic analysis of the failures of all the components of the assault, there was the danger of a repeat performance. It is as though any support for the tanks and their crews was tainted. Sometimes it was easier to blame the tanks as inanimate objects, conveniently forgetting that the men controlling the tanks were in fact larger targets than the infantry soldier on the battlefield. There is a convenient disassociation to use tanks as a personification. Those tanks drew far away from the soldiers rushing towards the German defences, and until each tank was disabled, it brought it down upon themselves. Bullecourt subsequently saw the 5th Army engage the Germans in a second assault on the 3rd of May with heavy German counterattacks. Fighting continued until petering out on the 17th of May with a partial German withdrawal. Although the Australians suffered another 7,000 casualties at 2nd Bullecourt, it is the action of the 11th of April which is remembered for the wrong reasons.